This is the Living Vertizontal podcast, brought to you by The Church at Riverstone, a fellowship of the Church of the Nazarene in Madera, California. Our episode today focuses on Matthew, chapter 26, verses 1 through 16. Together, we will be discussing our willingness to trade everything for Christ.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick.
I'm Natasha.
I'm Brittany.
I'm Derek.
And we are the Living Vertizontal podcast, back with you to continue working our way through Matthew. As a quick reminder, last week we finished our conversations through Matthew chapter 25, looking at verses 31 through 46. And in those verses, Jesus talked about the separation of the sheep and the goats. And together, we discuss Christ's call to remain focused on Him and to rest in the peace of knowing that He is our just advocate. This week, we're going to be turning into Matthew chapter 26, looking at verses 1 to 16. And this is the beginning of the final narrative block of Matthew. With this, we will discuss the plot to kill Jesus. We will look at Jesus' anointing and then also Judas's plan to betray Jesus. And I believe today we have Natasha reading for us. So, Natasha, would you mind reading Matthew 26, 1 to 16?
I can do that. Matthew 26, verse 1. When Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. While Jesus was in Bethany, in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. "Why this waste?" they asked. "This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor." Aware of this, Jesus said to them, "Why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over.
All right. Thank you for reading that for us. Really quick, before we move into a conversation about this particular reading, just to establish some, I guess, context for where we are in the movement of Matthew. I, in the intro, made the statement that it's the final, like, transition to the final narrative block, and by that I mean up to this point. So I think it's 24, 25, and 26 off the top of my head is like a teaching block where there is very focused and directed teaching that Jesus is doing to his disciples or to those around him, and it's the focus of those chapters is specifically the teaching itself. And then when you move into 26, verse 1 actually says, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, so wrapping up with a bow all of these teachings that he has been doing, he then turns and says to his disciples. And so it's marking this transition point now to where the teaching is going to become less of the focus going forward, and now it's a movement that becomes the focus. So before it was the content, and now it's like the movement again towards the cross. And so this marks the beginning of that final movement that we have towards the cross. And when we're also thinking about this particular conversation that we jump into today, this marks the beginning of the passion narrative, is what it would be kind of identified as, which passion, the passion narrative is like that final week of Jesus's walking of the earth in his ministry. And so this is the beginning of that. So as we think about like Holy Week, when we think about the Christian calendar, this would probably fall like on Wednesday of Holy Week, where this specific situation, Jesus having this conversation with the disciples, Jesus being anointed, and then Judas making the decision to betray him is all happening. So just so we have a point of reference maybe for this conversation today, and then also going forward, that's kind of where we are in the story of Jesus.
And so by Holy Week, we're talking about the week that's leading up to Easter specifically. Right. And so this is the Wednesday before we head into Easter Sunday. And so kind of in the middle, he's come in, he's entered into Jerusalem riding on the donkey. That happened this past Sunday, Palm Sunday. And so now here we are in the middle of the week.
Yes, exactly. And so I guess with that, let's jump into a more focused conversation on just specifically, 26:1 to 16. And in beginning that conversation, I think the first thing that really grabbed my attention in reading this was the two different like accounts, or the two different statements about Jesus's upcoming death. So first in verses 1 and 2, you have Jesus predicting his death. And there's some interesting things about the words that Jesus chooses to use here. But I'll go back to that in a second. So verses 1 and 2, you have Jesus predicting his death. And then verses 3, 4, and 5, you have the religious elite, religious officials plotting and planning his death. And as I was thinking about this, essentially you have the two kingdoms at work here. When Jesus predicts his death, you have this divine affirmation that is in fact the direction that Jesus's life is heading, that this is the plan. This is all in line with God's intention. And so you have that affirmation present. And then subsequent to that, you have the chief priests plotting and planning to kill Jesus. And so like there's this separate plan that is not necessarily God's intention, right? Like the betrayal part of it, the killing of Jesus because they're threatened by him. Like that's not God's perfect plan for them, I don't think. And yet that's being revealed here. And so it's like both of them are working to the same end, right? Jesus says, I'm going to die. They are plotting for his death. They are both working towards Jesus's death on the cross, but they're doing it for two separate reasons, right? You have God doing it for the salvation of the world, and you have the religious elite doing it in hopes of saving face or protecting their own authority in the world. So I thought that was really interesting. But to go back to Jesus's prediction of his death, this is the fourth prediction in Matthew that Jesus gives of his coming death. It is, however, the first prediction that is not also accompanied by a prediction of his subsequent resurrection. It is simply a statement of my death is coming, but it is framed in reference to the Passover meal. And I think that is very important as Jesus is continuing to try to help his followers understand the lens through which they need to be understanding the events that are to come. That this death does not mark the end of his like existence as Messiah. It actually marks the fulfillment of what that looks like. So I think, yeah, that was really what stuck out to me first.
You were talking about the predictions. I found in studying that the first prediction that Jesus told his disciples about in chapter 16, verse 21, references the very same individuals that are gathering to plot his death. So, what Jesus spoke is being fulfilled as he's, beginning to, share that he is the Passover lamb, that his blood will be what saves the people this time around.
Right. It's like a perfect book ending. Like if the first time that he predicts his death, he says it's going to be these people who are doing it, and then this final time that he's predicting his death, like cut scene, simultaneously to Jesus predicting his death, there's this group of people that he predicted would be planning his death are actually in the process of planning his death. It's like this perfect divine bookend to what's going on.
Another thing I think that I was drawn to in this first little set of verses, before we get into Jesus being anointed and this conversation about Judas, is in verse 5, the chief priests and the elders are still in their scheming. They're so concerned about external factors. They're so convinced that their way is right. Like they have no concern for God's thoughts necessarily on this issue. At least it's not something that seems to be openly discussed. And so they in verse 5, it says, but not during the festival, they said, or there may be a riot among the people. And so again, the Jews were being occupied by the Roman Empire. And so they had to be very, very careful of rioting. And they knew that Jesus had gained extreme popularity among the people because he had been doing miraculous healings and driving out demons and doing all these incredible things that were consistent with who the prophesied Messiah was. So the crowds were for him. And so there was this fear that if they were to arrest him, that the crowds might turn and they might cause this rioting. And if the rioting had occurred, which ironically, I feel like the chief priests and elders before had tried to use the rioting to their advantage, right? By trying to say that Jesus was causing the riots, but now they don't want the riots, right?
Well, because they don't want to be the cause of the riot.
Right. And so it's, so they're so calculated and so planned in their how they will arrest him and how it will be best and smoothest. And it's so sly. It reeks of evil. And I feel like there's just not much regard. There's so much logic and planning in this, that there's not a whole lot of regard for spiritual consultation. And these are the chief priests, right? These are the people who the Jews are relying on for dialogue with God about how to handle these things. And yet he seems to be completely absent from the conversations that are being had about how to rid this place of this Messiah claimer.
You talked about, like earlier in referencing the previous week, the passage from the previous week, like where our focus is. And so like, as we shift to this next portion of the passage, we see someone who has their focus on Jesus and what that looks like, or this recognition of Jesus and what that looks like. And then like we end with a contrast of not recognizing who Jesus is or losing focus of who Jesus is. And so like, as we like go through these two, we will see that really played out. What it means to focus on Jesus or to recognize Jesus as the Passover lamb. Like we have somebody that's going to come and give something, like buy something that is of great value, nearly a year's wage, and do so to anoint Jesus as the Passover lamb. And yet we see someone else who doesn't see that, who doesn't recognize Jesus as the lamb and is willing to reject and lose focus on who he is, even though we spent a great deal of time with him.
Yeah, I feel like I don't remember how many weeks ago it was. It's been a bit. But I remember we had this conversation about like when you come face to face with who Christ is, or you come face to face with the kingdom, like you have two choices, right? Like you can either accept it or you can reject it. And I feel like right here in the first 5 verses, we as the reader, them as the disciples, are coming face to face with the reality of the kingdom. And as we move forward into the 2 different conversations that follow between the woman who anoints him and then Judas, you see the 2 potential responses played out. Like you see how it looks to embrace the kingdom, and you see how it looks to reject the kingdom, and then the subsequent cost associated with that.
And even I think the rejection of the kingdom can be less overt than just rejecting it. I mean, I think it can become a very slippery slope to reject the kingdom. One thing leads to the next. I'm guessing Judas was, it just, for him, he lost sight. He lost sight of Jesus. He lost sight of who he was and what his calling was and what his mission was, even for a second. And it had a dramatic effect on his life and the lives of everyone around him.
We even had somebody use the example of trust, like trust comparing betraying Jesus for the 30 pieces of silver. But like in our lives, we can say, I trust Jesus. But then like when it comes to a hard time, we'll reach out to somebody else instead of Jesus and like try to, seek counsel. And not that seeking counsel is a bad thing, but like we'll reach out to somebody thinking that they know better than us or they have the answer. And really, like when that was said at our table, I was like, man, that's pretty good insight. Like that's not where my mind was at. So it doesn't have to be, this big overt thing, like you said, Natasha. It can start so small.
Well, is Jesus the Lord of your life, or is he not? If he's Lord of your life, you're going to give it all. Or if he's not, you're going to look for a way to save yourself. If you see, Judas, the disciples, they see what's coming. He's telling them, I'm going to die. And he's telling them, she's preparing me for burial. That's scary. If this person that you thought was coming and was going to save, he was coming to save the day. And, he's been talking, for some time about that he was going to die, but now he's talking about a burial. And that's a whole, that's a big deal. And Judas's response is, oh no, I need to save myself. I need to figure out what I'm going to do, because he's not going to save me, because he can't see.
Because he's going to be dead.
Sees. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And he can't see what Jesus sees. And he just sees this man who says he's going to save me, says he's going to die. So he's not going to be able to help me. I need to figure it out on my own. And how many times do we do that? Right. When, Jesus puts us in a situation where like, okay, Jesus, I'm going to trust you. But the moment something doesn't go the way you think it should go, you're like, okay, I got to figure this out. I have to think about this. I have to plan. I have to make sure I'm okay. Instead of just trusting that Jesus is going to take care of it all.
I think in merging both your conversation, Derek, and Brittany's together, I feel like we come to this place where really, I think we have to ask ourselves, how real is Jesus to me actually? Because ultimately, that's why we go get advice from someone else. Well, I can't hear him. Well, like he's not going to talk to me like I need to be talked to. And so he's like, not gonna meet my need in the way I need.
Or he isn't talking to me, like a refusal to say he's actually speaking.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think it's important for us to spend time contemplating the fact that he is actually here with us. And do I actually believe that? Or is this just something I say because I know it with my head, but I don't know it with my heart or my experience.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about we were talking about the servants and their response to what they were given. And, the third servant hid it because his perception of the king was he was going to be, he was a harsh man.
Yeah.
And if that's our perception of Jesus, and we think, hellfire and brimstone, like, yeah, I'm going to look for a way to save myself. But if we know Jesus, like this woman knew Jesus, she knew who he was. I can't imagine giving up something so precious for somebody that I just think might be a good idea.
Right.
Like I'm going to know that this man is here and he's going to save me. However he says he's going to do it, I'm going to trust that that's what he's going to do. And I'm going to give it all. And I mean that's how she knows.
I guess we speculate in this, but that perfume was like her savings. It was
like a year's wages.
It was her security, like, blanket. It was her savings account. It was her, it was her backup plan.
It was her retirement, her 401k.
Ouch.
It was everything.
Ouch. Are we? Ouch.
And she poured it out.
Yeah.
Because in comparison to Jesus, nothing else held value.
Earlier, Natasha, you made the statement that in reference to like the rejection of the kingdom, that it's not always an outright like rejection. And as soon as you said that, the thought came into my mind in thinking about this specific like anointing scene. The woman who anointed him is really the only one who didn't reject him. The rest of them, if you think about it, like they were indignant, they were upset, which there's another conversation we can have about that. But subsequent to this story, we know that every single one of those men run away. They flee. They're gone. I mean, they'll come back, right? So there is a return that happens. But in a moment when Jesus is being arrested and these predictions are no longer just words, but they are actually realities that are starting to set in, they run. And it's like they turn their back on the kingdom. They are faced with the reality, what am I going to do? And their instinct is to reject it. They run from it because they're afraid. Again, they come back. So I don't want to be too hard on them. But in this moment, there's only one person who sees the true value of who Jesus really is. And it's the unnamed woman. And that's all there is to it, which is, I don't know, it's crazy because when you hold it next to the Judas story, I guess we always just think, well, it's only Judas that betrayed him. But Peter denied him 3 times also. Like there's a lot, there's all of the others had their own betrayal story that could be had as well. Judas is the most prominent, but the rest of them had those too.
If these are the people who spent time with him,
right,
and physically saw these things, it's tough.
Well, and it just highlights like we can be spending time with Jesus, and the real trials of life as they come, they're going to test the authenticity of our faith. And at that moment, we're faced again with this choice, right? Are we going to grow in faith? Are we going to trust him, or are we going to run? Are we going to go our own way? Are we going to seek alternative advice? How do we respond? And I think there's hope in knowing that, like you said, Nick, they all came back, right? Mm-hmm. Even Judas, I mean, in some of the accounts, it's pretty clear that he comes to a place of complete
wrongdoing.
Right, yeah. Complete remorse and repentance. Right. And so there's this hope that even if we choose the wrong way, we always have the opportunity to come back. He stands there as the good father, waiting expectantly for us to return home and to do what he's called us to do, even if we're late. But I think it just goes to show how vulnerable we really are, even when we spend time in his presence.
I have to wonder if their question was honestly out of sincerity and not so much like if it was a question of, after having heard all that Jesus has said up to this point and hearing his heart and his desire to, to serve, if this question comes out of a place of servanthood. I mean, because they're asking like, why the waste? Like, why would we do this? Then they hear the response. And after they hear the response, it's at that point that Judas is, at least in my mind, I rationalize, he's like, well, kind of like was talked about earlier, like, well, I'm going to save myself in this scenario.
Right.
Because I feel like they're genuinely asking, like, well, wait a second, you just told us that we need to serve like you're serving. And so why would we waste all this money on this perfume when we could go and do all this good with the money that, could be brought in from that? And so I feel like there's this like genuine questioning going on, and maybe I'm totally wrong, but just based off of what we know prior to this.
No, I would agree with that for sure.
And so like, I feel like there's this genuineness, and yet in that genuineness, Judas, as Brittany said, like, I'm going to take care of me because I don't see a way out here. Like,
I think even in the genuine questioning, there is still a misunderstanding of what Jesus is asking of them, right? Like all along, he's asking for a heart change, and their concern is an action. Their concern is an action. They're not thinking about the inward conversation. Right. They're just concerned about an action. Right. Like, this woman just had an outward action that was super wasteful. What are you doing? And Jesus is like, oh, like, you've missed it again, guys. Yeah. Like, I think that they're well, mine says indignant. So their frustration, their indignance, is that a word? I don't know. Whatever. We'll go with it. Okay. But their feelings towards the situation, I think there is authenticity, and I think there is a desire to understand and a trying to understand what Jesus is saying. But I think there is still an element of they're still missing it. Right. And Judas definitely misses it the most, right? Like, he's the one who's just like way off the reservation because, and I think we talked about this a little bit on Sunday, where like all along, they have this perception of what Messiah is, right? And now Judas is come to the realization, the conclusion, after hearing it all these times, Jesus is going to die. So I'm going to protect myself, but that also means he's not the Messiah that I think is coming. And so he's got to be done away with.
Right. As you were talking about the disciples' response to the woman, I couldn't help but think about how we as the church often become distracted by the actions of younger Christians, or maybe less mature Christians, or honestly, maybe even more mature Christians that we just don't understand fully. And we judge their outward actions so strongly and so heavily, and yet their heart is one that's just gold. And we completely miss the heart because we're so fixated on this outward appearance. I think about the story, and I don't know that we have time to go into it, but Hal has a story that he shares, I think, just when he goes to summits. I don't think it's even in his books, but about little church and big church, right? And he talks about how in the little church, basically there's like this guy who got clean from drugs and a whole bunch of just kind of your typical, just miraculous life transformation story. Yeah. And so he starts this Bible study group in his home with the assistance of his pasta. That's right, with the assistance of his pasta. And so they continue to meet, and he brings all of his friends in there, and they're just getting saved right and left, and they're working on holiness together. And there's one particular lady who shows up one week, and she's just really sad. And, she's sharing that she has this problem that her and her husband, they keep getting in arguments, and she keeps whacking him. She keeps smacking him. And, the next week they ask her, okay, how's it going? She shakes her head. No, it's not better. Not better. I smacked him again. Good. And then the next week, same thing. But then one week she comes in and she is just glowing. And so they got to hear what is that? Did you not get in a fight with your husband this week? Did it go better? And she goes, oh no, but I only smacked him once. And she was just thrilled. I mean, and as they're talking about this, and they're talking about this church and what they're going through, he talks about how he can't bring this little church plant into the mainstream church that the guy who started all of this with the life transformation, the big church he attended. He can't bring them in because they would never understand that woman's story. They become so caught up on the fact that you smacked your husband, that they would miss the heart behind what has been going on in her life and the victory that Jesus and the Holy Spirit has worked in her life. And so as you were talking about that, Nick, it just made me, and I know that's, a very extreme example, but I think about our kids oftentimes, and I feel like sometimes I'm overly critical of their behavior in worship or their responses to questions. And so I think if I can be more patient in listening and looking with the eyes of Jesus to hear the heart behind the action and behind the response, that I might actually have a lot more to celebrate than I presently do, because I'm missing it.
Feels like last week, we talked about with the sheep and the goats and we talked about the judgment and about how that's not our responsibility. Leave it to the judge to do the judging. Just keep focused on the task that's been placed before us, or just loving Jesus. So I don't know.
Which now makes this all the more ironic, because he just said that, and then the disciples turn around and they're judging this woman. So there's
true.
hope for us.
Yeah.
So one question that was brought up at the table that I was at on Sunday was this: the story of the woman anointing Jesus is different in almost every gospel. Do you guys have any idea why that might be?
Okay, so I noticed this as I was reading and specifically, actually, as I was preparing the kids' bulletin for this past week. And so this story, if you're following along in your Bible and you want to check it out, cross references are Mark 14, 1 through 11. We see the same set of stories. Also in Luke 22, 1 through 6, and then John 12, 1 through 11. And so in each of these, there's different nuances to the story, but they're similar enough that they make you feel like they're possibly the same story. And so there's kind of a couple of different ways that scholars have looked at this. So one option is that these actually, some of the differences in the accounts may be a result of the fact that these are actually two isolated events, or three isolated, different instances where a very similar type thing took place. For example, I think in John, it talks about how the oil is actually poured on the feet of Jesus, whereas both Mark and Matthew talk about it being poured on his head. So that's an example of kind of one of the differences you might run into. Also, John names this woman as Mary Magdalene, whereas Mark and Matthew leave this as an undefined woman. And so we're kind of, one possibility is that these are actually different stories, and that that they can be viewed that way. Another school of thought is that because the Gospels were written, not all of them firsthand, right on the spot accounts, but were actually written down after years of oral tradition, it's possible that some of the details maybe have been, not remembered perfectly accurately. However, we can rely on the fact that in each of these stories, this truth, the truths we've been talking about thus far, the heart of this story is still the same. And so that is what's preserved. And so it gives us a picture into the God that we serve and what his expectation is for us. And so whether or not Jesus was anointed by his feet, at his feet or at his head, whether it was Mary or some undisclosed person, whether, whichever of the disciples, whether it was Judas only who was complaining or if it was all the disciples who were complaining, these details may not be super important to the overall message of the story. And so perhaps maybe they are the same, but the details don't matter as much. So again, two schools of thought, one kind of saying, well, maybe they're different instances, events, and then the other saying, well, maybe some of the details are scrambled a little bit just because of the oral tradition that occurred before the writing down of the Gospels actually happened.
So we have this first example then of the woman and her response to the kingdom. When coming face to face with the kingdom, she sees the exceeding value of it. And much like the earlier parable, that was months ago, where the individual in the story sold everything they had so they could buy the land, right, that had that treasure in it, a surpassing value. This woman recognizes the value of the kingdom standing before her in the form of Jesus, and she pours everything out on him. And then we move on to the story of Judas, and we have the second response, the other option for how we can respond when we come face to face with the kingdom. And his response is not one of embrace, but one of rejection.
So I found two things in my study of this portion of the passage that I found interesting. And so one of them comes from Zechariah chapter 11, verse 12, where there's this talk about the shepherd. And the shepherd says, basically, if I'm not worth it, then pay me 30 pieces of silver. And so like when it says here in verse 15, and asked, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you? So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. And so it's almost as if the shepherd was rejected in that passage in Zechariah for 30 pieces of silver. And it's the same thing happening. The shepherd is being rejected for 30 pieces of silver. What Judas betrayed Jesus for was worth less than what the woman gave up in her perfume to anoint Jesus with. That was the thing that kind of hit me as we went through this. Like, what is Jesus worth to me? And even this was the conversation we had on Sunday, Nick. What is my life doing to show the value that I've said that Jesus has, more than just words? This would be like that the disciples where they think action, like they're always thinking on action. And in my life, what is the action that shows that he has that much value, that I'm willing to give something of great value?
I think we often, as a church, we ask this question. Well, really, it's Jesus's question after Peter denies him 3 times, and then he's later restored.
At his restoration,
right? Yeah. Jesus, he asked Peter, "Do you love me more than these?" And so I feel like that question can be asked of us, and I think we do ask it regularly as a church of one another. But what are the these in our life? And I feel like that's kind of summing up Derek, what you've shared on your heart, what are the these that I'm holding in my life that I may be hanging on to more tightly than I hang on to Jesus, or that are keeping me from loving Jesus perfectly? Be sure to follow the Living Vertizontal podcast to stay current on all our new releases. To learn more about the Church at Riverstone, visit us at thechurchatriverstone.org.